The summary of everything and some of the conclusions that I was able to draw after that is that I really found that my students had trouble representing, having to express or produce an answer at the abstract and the representational level when they had to write a fraction that was greater than, less than, or equal to, whether they had to draw it or write one, especially dealing with unlike denominators or fractions that they weren't used to using. When it was halves, fours, thirds, sixths, those are fractions that they've kind of been using since elementary school, and so they felt very comfortable using those. But when you started having them work with fifths and, or not fifths and tenths, but maybe fifths and twelfths, those to them, they can't do a quick common denominator, and so they were having a little bit more difficulty with those. And then I also found that, especially at the representational level, they didn't always show exactly what a fraction was, and I kind of found out that maybe my students don't really know what it means to have a fraction, and that all the little pieces should be the same size, and that when they're comparing two fractions, hey, the two drawings that I create, the two strips that I draw, the two circles that I draw kind of need to be the same size if I want to be able to compare the areas. And I don't think they truly had an understanding of that, so that is definitely something that I will want to target in my instruction. I also noticed that my students sometimes confuse the greater than, less than, and equal, well, not the equal to sign, but the greater than and less than signs. Sometimes I think that maybe the students knew which one was bigger because of some of the notes that I could see off to the side, but they put the wrong symbol in there. And no matter how many times you give them a little alligator mouth or a Pac-Man or little clues to remember which one's which, some students just have a hard time learning that symbol. It's not something they use in their everyday life, and so therefore they don't remember it, over long periods of time. They need a teacher. And that's when you go to circle the larger fraction and those sorts of things to show the teacher that they understand which fraction truly is larger or smaller. But I personally would still want them to try to understand that symbol eventually. But I do, for assessment purposes, I want to know whether or not they understand the concept of a greater than, less than fraction, not the symbol here. I was happy to see that most of my students ended up at an instructional or mastery level, but there were still definite groups almost kind of falling out as I kind of sorted the data. And one of the things I noticed is that all my students really kind of needed some help with the true concept and the conceptual understanding of comparing fractions. But then I did notice that one group of students really needed more and a higher level of support, especially at the concrete level. And then there was another group of students who was a little bit more independent, but they showed some more mastery that they could do that concrete on their own, but to really help enforce that concept rather than just the procedure. And then my final group, which was a group that was pretty much independent, they kind of had it. I really had them working with almost no help from me pretty much to go kind of further and extend it into the representational and drawing fractions. As a teacher, I feel like I know my students very well, and even as much as I try, there's still the group of students that typically get the A's on the tests, and there's still those students that always seem to struggle on the tests. But especially with this assessment, you always have that one or two kids that are going to surprise you, and I had some students who are pretty low performers in class actually show a lot of mastery at some of these levels, and they ended up getting put into the group that needed the least amount of support. And it was wonderful for me to have, and I think for that student to kind of feel like, hey, I'm not always going to be in that bottom group. And so I feel that this is a time to really focus on the fact that my groups aren't always the same every day. A lot of times there are going to be similar students in similar groups, and they do notice that. Middle school kids are aware of groups. They're very aware of groups. And so it's nice that with this dynamic assessment that you will have kids that'll move up, and then you'll have a kid who usually is making ace and everything that might really need to go back into that group that needs the higher level of support. And so it kind of just It's a reality check for everybody.